Let's start with a conversation between Simon Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief of BioCentury, and John Crowley, Chairman and CEO of Amicus Therapeutics. In 1992, two of John's children were diagnosed with Pompe disease. John has since been on a lifelong journey in finding cure for Pompe and other rare diseases. He's the inspiration for the movie Extraordinary Measures, and definitely an inspiration for us all. Please join me in welcoming John and Simon.
John, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. And I want to start the conversation with something you've said, which is that we know a lot about the biology of Pompe disease, but we still don't know what's the answer. So in your mind, what is the state of the art about the disease, and what do you see as the principal hurdles that are left to uncover?
Well, Simone, first of all, thank you for doing this. Pompe disease for many of us has been a journey. It's one that we never planned for in our lives, whether you're a patient or a family member. As we sit here today, we've come a long way, particularly in the last couple of decades, at really understanding the fundamental biology of the disease. We understand, of course, the buildup of glycogen. We understand a missing or defective protein. But what we've also come to realize is there are many hundreds of mutations that can lead to the defect in that same gene and the deficiency of that same enzyme and a buildup of that same substrate. But because of the uniqueness of the mutations, but also because of the uniqueness of our body, our anatomy, our genetics, it leads to vastly different outcomes. And as we know, we can see patients diagnosed at birth with severe infantile forms of the disease, all the way to, I've met some patients in some cases out past 70 years of age before they get their Pompe diagnosis. So there is some core biology, and we understand it better than we ever have. And the challenge now is, how do we utilize that understanding of biology to make medicines, and to make medicines to stave off the effects of the disease, or ultimately to reverse what is a mistake of nature, to provide as much health and longevity to people as we can. So as we sit here today, we've got a pretty good understanding of the biology of Pompe disease. Not fully, there's still more that we need to learn, but really what we've been working on for quite a few years now, and what we'll continue to work on for at least the next decade or longer, until we finally truly have cures, particularly for newly diagnosed patients. We really need to understand, how do we apply that knowledge of medicine, or biology rather, to making medicines. And there, thankfully, we've got a lot of tools in our arsenal that we've never had before. Programs that we've never thought about, like gene editing, that till 8-9 years ago, nobody had ever thought of, all the way to gene therapy that's been in the mix for decades, but is finally starting to make some headway and progress, even just beginning clinical studies, and a whole range of other approaches that people have. So on one hand, it's still a very challenging disease. We still don't have cures. We need more treatments. We need more effective treatments across the board. And ultimately, I think we're going to get to a point where we've developed custom tailored approaches for each patient as an individual, based on their genetics, their background, their severity of disease. So as customized an approach to personalized medicine as we can have. We're not there yet, but it's finally in the next decade or so, I think, hopefully with insights.
So a little bit later in the discussion, I want to come to the issue of the Pompe community, which is a very active one. But let's continue this thread that you've just talked about. And you've said again, I love your quotes, Pompe is monogenic, but it's not monolithic. I want to talk a little bit, you mentioned gene therapy. So there are many emerging modalities now, new modalities, and many of these are being deployed in rare diseases. So can you expand a little bit on the intersection of these with Pompe disease, and how they might play out, where you think that there's more hope for use of those new modalities?
Yeah, I think more and more we're realizing that a lot of these modalities that maybe weren't thought of in the context of Pompe disease may actually have some applications to help people living with Pompe. So we've been blessed in some regards in the Pompe community in that we were among the first to have the option of an enzyme replacement therapy. We hopefully have more enzyme replacement therapy options coming to patients. We've all been thinking about gene therapy for a long time. And I remember when our Megan and Patrick were diagnosed in 1998, I reached out to one of the world's leading researchers who had just published a paper on gene therapy. I asked a lot of questions, most of them probably pretty naive, but I did ask the question, when could it be in patients? And he said a year, maybe two. Well, it took more than 20 years to get to the point where we're just now beginning to treat patients in clinical studies. So, continued work, continued promise on the gene therapy front. I think candidly, Pompe is a very complex disease for gene therapy. You've got all the issues that everybody is wrestling with still in terms of targeting, safety, efficacy, getting to all muscles of disease, manufacturability, ultimately cost, all of those issues. I think we probably have about a decade of work ahead of us as a field in gene therapy. But again, we're starting to see the very early promise of gene editing technologies broadly in biotechnology and specifically in Pompe, but other approaches, small molecules, what are known as antisense oligonucleotides. So great big science word that means that we may actually be able to intervene with a shot or a pill, with a whole new technology. And other new technologies that have been invented for other diseases that are now being looked at to be applied to Pompe, and others that are just now being invented. So again, I think we're finally on the cusp of this golden age of genetic medicine. And I think Pompe very much will be at the forefront. I see over and over again companies in their presentations, I see academics in their papers applying new technologies to Pompe, where 10, 20 years ago, it was a very limited universe of researchers and companies. And I think that's terrific. Competition will bring innovation and it'll speed timelines. So I'm excited about a lot of things we're seeing, and I think ultimately it'll be very customized.
Let's talk about that for a minute, if we can. We often see multiple innovators working in the same rare disease, which actually might seem counterintuitive since there are so many rare diseases and each of them has so few patients. But there are really advantages of competition in a small patient population diseases. And maybe you could sort of spell out how these different innovators are pushing each other forward.
Sure. I think, competition is a good thing. We always view the disease as the competition. And the more horsepower we can bring to that, I think is a good thing. Ultimately, you're not going to have in Pompe or any rare diseases too many players. That will never be the case. If many technologies end up working, the best ones will leap to the forefront and they will be the most successful, and people will divert their resources, their capital elsewhere if Pompe becomes a satisfied patient population. We're not there yet. We're not even close. So in that regard, I think having multiple players is a great thing. I think in some areas we need to think about cooperating better. For instance, when we think about clinical trials, our natural history studies, our registry studies, I think more and more we need to be open to sharing that data as tool sets for all innovators, everybody making medicines. And I think when we look too at the potential to share technologies, I think you'll start to see more and more of that. I think you'll end up seeing that it's, again, not going to be one size fits all. For years, we've had one option. Hopefully we'll have more soon. But over the next 5, 10, 15 years, I think we'll have many, many more. It'll be customized to people's individual mutations, their stage of disease. So at the front of all of that, we've got to have a lot of irons in the fire because most of them aren't going to make it through. And hopefully those that do will make a profound difference for people.
So let's talk a little bit about the patient community. And I want to bracket this. The last major global public health catastrophe was AIDS. In many ways, that was the origin of patient advocacy, at least insofar as its impact on the biomedical industry or biomedical community. And patient advocates are now a major part of the bio-innovation ecosystem. So what have we learned along the way?
We've learned a lot, and we've been able to apply it in a way that will advance development. So, and it's a great example, Simone. You go back to the HIV activism of the late 80s, when HIV was the health scourge of the world, and drug development was moving very slowly, and the HIV community wouldn't stand for it. And I mean, the protests that happened, the calls for congressional action, the public awareness, it accelerated research and development. The first drug ever approved, AZT, for AIDS, a barely effective, highly toxic molecule that got approved on a surrogate marker endpoint. And it didn't cure AIDS, but what it did was open up the field to many, many innovators. You had a lot of players. In fact, back then, people said we have too many people involved in HIV, and we didn't. In fact, we probably didn't even have enough. But when you look at that model, over the next decade, more than 24 medicines became approved, to the point now where HIV is by and large an effectively managed chronic condition. And that happened, it really, the wellspring for that began with the patient community and their demands for not only safe and effective medicines, but that it be looked at through a benefit risk assessment through the patient's eyes. We, if you fast forward then, just about 4.5, 5 years ago, there was a major piece of legislation. It was the last major piece signed by President Obama, bipartisan legislation, the 21st Century Cures Act. And many pieces of that mandated bringing in the patient perspective. For instance, patient-focused drug development forums grew out of that time period. We just had one in Pompe last summer. Bringing the patient voice is critically important. It's not only good for the patient community to be informed, to know, to be able to shape development timelines and ultimately a choice of medicines. It makes the development programs better. Bringing, whenever we go to the FDA, we always bring a patient representative with any disease. And we begin every FDA meeting with 5 minutes with the patient perspective on whatever that topic may be. So I think it's a great thing. I think you're seeing more of it. And what I'm actually seeing now is a change in mindset across the industry, small companies and large, across academia, where it's always been welcome to have the patient perspective, but among regulators as well. We had a meeting with the agency probably about 1.5 years ago. We brought a Pompe patient representative, and she began the meeting, and she happened to be just sitting kind of behind the executives from our company in the front. And the lead medical reviewer at the FDA asked who she was, and she spoke up more. And she said, would you please step to the table? She said, we work for you. And I think that was great. And I think it was very genuine. And it brought just a different tone to that exchange. And I think elevated the patient perspective on a par with any medical or science perspective offered in that meeting. And I hope that's something that continues broadly.
So let's bracket the conversation with the current pandemic, hopefully soon to be over, but let's see how long that rolls.
Hopefully.
Are there lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic for Pompe disease or more broadly for rare diseases?
I think for both, actually. You look at some of the tools that were employed. You look at the frequent interactions, the risk-benefit assessment that was done through design of clinical studies, the constant feedback with regulators. I think there are some tool sets and examples we can use to make sure that we always develop, medicines by the gold standard that are safe and effective, but that also are developed with a great sense of urgency. And so I think maybe the greatest thing we can take away from the lessons of the COVID crisis that we could apply to development in Pompe or any rare disease is really a mindset. And you think about what was always underlying the development of vaccines over the last year. It was the notion, number one, we need vaccines that are safe and effective. Number two, we have to ensure 100% access, ultimately globally, to every person in the world. And number three was time. We knew we could make a vaccine, that this was a druggable target, if you will. We could make a vaccine. We knew we could beat this mistake of nature in COVID, but we needed to beat time. And so that sense of urgency became so great. If we can take that mindset, safe and effective medicines, access for all, and the notion that it's a race against time in every one of these diseases, especially a disease like Pompe, I think that will have long-lasting and positive effects on drug development broadly.
So, continuing this thread of the pandemic, we have seen, I have been fortunate to have a front row seat to some of this, the most extraordinary coming together of, I use the word competitors in its broadest sense, but different pharma companies, everybody really pulling together. And I think, I don't know if it's created a paradigm shift, but it certainly forged some new friends in the foxhole that we hope will continue in the post-pandemic era. Do you see alliances, new alliances coming out of this for rare diseases and for patient communities coming together? And I want to also ask you to put a global aspect on that. Do you see that? You talked about global access. So how much harder is that for patient communities in different countries?
It really varies. You look at the sophistication of some of the patient communities that have been developed here in the States and Europe and elsewhere, where they've had access to medicines in Pompe or other rare diseases. That's been incredibly helpful, and that's grown in its stature and level of helpfulness and respect. But I've seen it elsewhere too. I've been to China a couple of times. I've met with Pompe patients in China, Fabry patients, the Chinese Organization of Rare Diseases. I've been to the Middle East, I've been to Eastern Europe, Latin America, and you're seeing the same themes. They're just at a different stage of their development. So I think if we can increase patient awareness, patient advocacy broadly around the world, you will start to continue to see the interconnectedness of these organizations. We're, I think, in an advantaged spot with great leadership in the IPA, in the International Pompe Association. And in fact, in some respects, the Pompe community globally is a real example for a lot of other rare diseases. So you will see much more of that, I think, ahead. You'll also see it among regulators. There is a mechanism now, at least for the US and the European Medicines Agency, to coordinate on rare disease programs. I know they're doing it in Pompe disease now. And I think that's a good thing to reduce the timelines, to reduce inefficiencies, make sure you don't have two different studies for development of a medicine, different endpoints, try to harmonize that as best we can. Anything that strengthens development, anything that shortens timelines for access to medicine, I think is a great thing. Years ago when our kids were diagnosed, I kind of had this dream that I would take all the smartest Pompe experts in the world and kind of lock them in a room and tell them you couldn't come out until you figured it out together. Well, we didn't do that, but from time to time, we've had a chance to be very well connected as a community. And we are blessed as well, having such knowledgeable and candidly passionate experts in the field. The doctors who are willing to work hard, to always put patients' interests first, to work with a range of new technologies. That gone are the days where doctors would only work with one company. Those days are gone. And that, I think, is a good thing. So hopefully we'll see more and more collaboration. But again, the notion of competition, I think, is a good thing to make sure that everybody's sharp. Everybody's always developing the best medicines. I've always believed that if you can make the best medicines and get them to as many people as quickly as possible, you will build a great and lasting company. And we have room for many great and lasting companies in the rare disease field and even within Pompe disease.
John, let's finish on a personal note. You've certainly been a force to be reckoned with in this disease, and I think more broadly in rare diseases. Tell us where your children, your family are now, and how you view your mission going forward.
The kids are great today. As we all know, Pompe disease, as much as it devastates muscles of people living with Pompe, it doesn't affect the mind. And the kids have been blessed to be incredibly smart and precocious. I look at our younger son, Patrick, is now 23 years old. Patrick just turned 23, and he finished public high school here, did some post-high school education, and he now works in a flower shop. He has a part-time job in a flower shop in Princeton. It is hard for Patrick. He's very profoundly affected by the disease. But he wants to live as deep and fulfilling a life as he can and to give back to others. And then our Megan, as many of you know, went off to college in 2015, 600 miles from our home in Princeton, New Jersey. Megan went to the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. She finished in 4 years with a double major, spent every one of her 4 years every night in a dorm room at Notre Dame. She then moved down to North Carolina, and Megan began studies in the School of Social Work. Megan is pursuing a master's in social work degree at the University of North Carolina. She'll complete that this spring. Obviously, during COVID, it's been remote. And Megan hopes to work with rare disease families as a social worker. Our vision continues to be a big one. For our family, it's to live as long and healthy and happy lives as we can. I've always told our kids, I just want you to be happy, safe, and fulfilled. And I think that's kind of what every parent wishes for their child, whether they live with a muscle disease or whatever challenge they may have. And we all have challenges at different times and to different degrees. And, our vision for the field is one where looking out to the future where many of these diseases, including Pompe, are quickly diagnosed and very effectively treated. And I hope someday a disease like Pompe, effectively what we're doing with these technologies, Simone, is we're accelerating what would happen through hundreds or thousands of years of human evolution to really extend and enhance people's lives. And that's what I hope that a decade, 2 decades from now, that in Pompe disease, a child is born, quickly diagnosed, whether they would be symptomatic immediately or decades from then, the parents sit down and with the physician, and the doctor says, your child has an enzyme deficiency, but we have a cure, and here's the plan. That's a very different world than most of us have known our whole lives here. So that's the hope, and it's one that we can finally begin to see come to fruition, still with a lot of work ahead of us. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's certainly an inspirational vision. I think it's true not only for Pompe and rare diseases, but all diseases that we can actually have that vision. So thank you, John. Thank you for your advocacy and your work in that field as well.
Thank you. All right. Be well. Thank you. God bless.